Harlem. Winter, 1932. A white club owner publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson in front of 200 witnesses. No gunfire, no punches thrown, no blood spilled. Just 90 seconds later. Every note of music across Harlem vanished into silence. New York began to panic. So how did one man's quiet rage rewrite the rules of an entire city? The Velvet Room sat on 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, smelling like money, trying to hide the stench of fear underneath. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings, built to make poor people feel smaller than they already were. White tablecloths, silver cutlery polished until you could see your own funeral in the reflection. A piano player in the corner working through Chopin like he was being paid by the note. Which he probably was. Bumpy Johnson arrived at 9:30 wearing a charcoal suit tailored on Lenox Avenue by a man who understood how fabric should move when you walked with purpose. He came alone. Unusual for someone in his position. But tonight required no witnesses from his side of the conversation. The maitre d' looked at him the way you look at dirt tracked onto an expensive carpet you just had cleaned that morning. "Mr. Johnson," the maitre d' said, voice smooth as oil floating on water. "Mr. Carmichael is expecting you in the private room." He gestured toward the back without offering to escort him personally. A small insult delivered so subtly that calling it out would seem petty and beneath dignity. Bumpy walked past tables full of white faces that turned to watch him pass by slowly. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. He was the only black man in the room not carrying a tray or mopping a floor. The private room held 12 people, seated around a mahogany table that could have fed 50. Richard Carmichael sat at the head, 60 years old. Silver hair combed back like a politician. He owned 4 nightclubs in Manhattan, 2 in Brooklyn, a piece of every liquor distribution network. His wealth came from prohibition, from selling illegal alcohol to people with enough money to pretend laws did not apply to them personally. Carmichael did not stand when Bumpy entered, did not offer his hand, did not acknowledge his arrival with anything more than a glance that lasted exactly 1 second. Then his eyes returned to the conversation he was having with a man in a navy suit who smelled like expensive cologne and inherited money nobody had earned honestly. Bumpy stood near the door, waiting. 3 minutes passed, then 5. The conversation at the table continued as if he were invisible, as if he were a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong address by mistake. Finally, Carmichael turned his head, looked at Bumpy with eyes cold as January rain, spoke loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "Johnson," he said. "Not Mr. Johnson. Just the last name like you call a dog. I understand you run numbers in Harlem. Small operation. Pennies from washerwomen and porters who cannot afford to lose what little they have." He paused, let the insult settle into the air like dust on expensive furniture. "I am expanding my business into your neighborhood. I wanted to inform you personally, as a courtesy, before my people begin operations next week." The room went silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward Bumpy, waiting for the reaction they all expected, waiting for anger, for threats, for the violence that men like Carmichael expected from men who looked like Bumpy Johnson. The band in the main room stopped playing mid-song, as if the musicians sensed something shifting. Even the clink of glasses and silverware ceased, replaced by silence thick as smoke. Bumpy's face remained perfectly still. No expression, no movement except the slow blink of his eyes like a predator deciding when to strike. Inside, his mind worked like a machine, recording every detail for later use when payment came due. Carmichael's posture, the smirk on the navy suit's face, the way others at the table leaned back slightly, preparing for an explosion. But Bumpy did not explode. did not reach for the weapon everyone knew he carried under his left arm, did not raise his voice or clench his fists into weapons ready to be deployed. He simply looked at Carmichael the way you look at a man who just signed his own death warrant without realizing it yet. Then he glanced at his watch. The second hand swept past the 12. 90 seconds began ticking down like a countdown to something irreversible. Carmichael's smile widened, mistaking silence for submission, for weakness, for surrender without a fight. "I am glad we understand each other," he said, turning back to his guests like the matter was settled. "You are dismissed, Johnson. My assistant will contact you next week with details about how payments will be structured going forward." Bumpy nodded once, turned, walked toward the door with the same measured pace he had entered with minutes before. Behind him, laughter erupted from the table. The kind of laughter that comes from men who believe they just humiliated someone without consequence. The kind that makes you remember every word, every face, every detail for the moment when accounts come due. Outside, the winter air hit Bumpy's face like a slap. He stood on the sidewalk, watching taxis roll past, watching white couples in furs and top hats climb out of cars. They disappeared into restaurants where black people could only enter through the kitchen if they were lucky. His jaw worked once, testing if anything was broken, then went still like water freezing. 90 seconds had passed since he looked at his watch. In that time, Carmichael had sealed his fate without knowing it, without understanding what he had just set in motion. Bumpy turned north, walking toward Harlem, toward home, toward the neighborhood Carmichael thought he could take with money and threats and the arrogance of men who had never been told no. The music from the Velvet Room faded behind him, replaced by the sound of his shoes on concrete, steady and deliberate as a countdown, as measured as a death sentence being carried out in slow motion. What Carmichael did not understand, what none of those men in that private room understood, was that power in Harlem did not come from expensive suits or mahogany tables or crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings. It came from the people, and when you disrespect one man in front of the world, you disrespect everyone who stands behind him, everyone who shares his struggle, everyone who remembers what it costs to survive. Bumpy Johnson walked home that night knowing exactly what would happen next. Not because he had planned it with phone calls and strategy meetings, but because Harlem would respond the only way it knew how when someone tried to take what belonged to them. The clock kept ticking. The music would stop soon, and Richard Carmichael would learn what it cost to humiliate a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard by thousands. Time moves differently when you are waiting for something terrible to begin, when you can feel it building like pressure before a storm breaks and drowns everything. Bumpy Johnson walked north from Fifth Avenue toward Harlem, and every step felt like it lasted an hour, even though his watch said otherwise. His mind replayed the scene in Carmichael's private room, frame by frame, word by word, storing it in the place where he kept every insult that would eventually require payment. The subway station at 42nd Street swallowed him. He descended stairs into the tunnel where electric lights flickered against tile walls stained yellow from decades of smoke and human breath, and 10 million people passing through without stopping. A train arrived, doors opening with a mechanical shriek that echoed off concrete and steel, and the ghosts of everyone who had stood exactly where he stood now. Bumpy stepped inside, found a seat near the back where he could see every face. Other passengers gave him space without realizing why, moving to different cars without conscious thought about it. There was something in his stillness that warned people away, an invisible boundary that said approach at your own risk and accept the consequences. The train rocked forward, metal wheels screaming against metal tracks, pulling him north toward 125th Street and the neighborhood where he was king without needing a crown. 90 seconds became 5 minutes, then 10. But the feeling that started in Carmichael's private room spread through Harlem faster than any subway train could travel underground. It moved through phone lines and conversations in barbershops where men gathered to complain about everything and solve nothing. Through whispers between musicians tuning instruments before their evening sets, preparing to perform for white tourists who came uptown to feel dangerous. Nobody knew exactly what had happened yet. No details, no specifics. But they felt it the way animals feel earthquakes before they arrive. The way sailors sense storms building on horizons they cannot see. At the Cotton Club on 142nd Street, Duke Ellington's band was setting up for the night's performance like they did every night without variation. The trumpet player, a man named William who sent money home to Georgia every month, felt his hands start shaking while he cleaned his mouthpiece. He could not explain why. Just a feeling, a pressure in the air like the moment before lightning strikes and changes everything in a single flash that burns the world white. 4 blocks south, a taxi driver named Marcus sat in his cab outside the Teresa Hotel, waiting for fares that would pay for his daughter's medicine. The radio played swing music from a station in New Jersey. Then it stopped mid-song. Just silence. Marcus turned the dial, trying to find the station again. But the music was gone. Only static remained, crackling like something burning in the distance, getting closer with every second. On Lenox Avenue, a newsstand operator named Samuel watched people walk past without stopping to buy papers like they usually did this time of night. Normally, workers heading home needed something to read on the subway, something to make them forget the day they just survived. But tonight everyone walked faster. Heads down, like they were trying to reach safety before something dangerous arrived at their doorstep. Nobody spoke about what they were feeling. Not yet. But across Harlem, in apartments and corner stores and pool halls and churches, people stopped what they were doing. They looked toward windows as if expecting to see something coming from far away. Something that would change everything they knew. The neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for news that had not arrived but was already felt in bones and blood. Bumpy's train pulled into 125th Street Station at 10:15. He climbed stairs back to street level, emerged into Harlem where the air smelled like fried chicken and coal smoke and winter rain that had not started falling yet but would soon. The streets were crowded, people moving between restaurants and speakeasies and basement clubs where jazz played until sunrise or the police showed up. Whichever came first. But something was different tonight. The laughter sounded forced. The conversations felt hurried. Everyone was moving faster, looking over their shoulders, sensing the shift in something they could not name. Bumpy walked past the Apollo Theater where a crowd lined up for the late show, past Small's Paradise where the doorman nodded without speaking. His expression asking a question Bumpy did not answer yet because the answer would come soon enough. Past the barbershop where old men played checkers and argued about baseball and politics and everything else worth arguing about. Except tonight they sat silent, staring at the board without moving any pieces, as if the game had stopped mattering somewhere between the last move and this moment. Bumpy reached his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue at 10:30. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, unlocked his door, stepped inside to a living room that held a sofa, a radio, a bookshelf full of volumes about history and philosophy and war strategy. He removed his coat, hung it carefully on a wooden hanger, walked to the window that overlooked Harlem spreading south toward Midtown Manhattan, where Carmichael sat in his club believing he had won something tonight. The phone on the side table rang. Bumpy picked it up. Stephanie Saint. Claire's voice came through, sharp and urgent like a blade cutting through darkness looking for something soft. What happened? She did not need to explain the question. She felt it too. whatever was moving through Harlem like electricity through power lines. "Carmichael humiliated me," Bumpy said, his voice flat as a frozen lake. "In front of 12 people. Told me he is taking over our numbers operation. Treated me like I was nothing. Like I was invisible. Like I did not exist." Silence on the other end. Not empty. Full of calculation. Of planning. Of deciding what came next. Then Stephanie spoke again, her words careful and measured like a surgeon choosing where to cut. "What are you going to do?" Bumpy looked out the window at Harlem spreading below him, lights flickering in windows, people moving on sidewalks, music drifting from clubs and bars like the heartbeat of something alive and dangerous. "Nothing," he said. "I am going to do nothing, and Harlem is going to do everything." He hung up the phone without saying goodbye, walked to his kitchen, poured whiskey into a glass, sat at his table in the dark, listening to the city breathe outside his window, listening to Harlem prepare for something it did not understand yet but would soon. Somewhere in Manhattan, Richard Carmichael was celebrating a victory he thought he had earned tonight with words and insults and the arrogance of rich men. But victories require more than one man's humiliation. They require submission. And Bumpy Johnson had not submitted. He had simply absorbed the insult, stored it away, and set in motion something that Carmichael would not understand until it was too late to stop, too late to apologize, too late to take back words that could not be unspoken. The clock on the wall read 10:45. 90 seconds had stretched into an hour. Soon it would stretch into days. And when it finally stopped, Harlem would be different. Carmichael would be different. And everyone who witnessed what came next would remember that some insults cannot be answered with fists or bullets, or the immediate satisfaction of violence. Some insults require a response so total, so complete, that the lesson lasts generations and gets passed down like inheritance from fathers to sons. The music stopped at midnight, not all at once, but close enough that anyone paying attention could feel the silence spreading like spilled ink across paper, staining everything it touched with something permanent. It started at the Cotton Club, where Duke Ellington's band was supposed to play until 3 in the morning for 300 customers who paid $5 each to pretend they understood jazz. William, the trumpet player, set down his instrument mid-song without warning, without explanation, without caring what happened next. He stood up from his chair, walked off stage, left his trumpet behind on the stand like it was just metal and not the thing that fed his family. The pianist stopped playing. The drummer let his sticks rest. The bass player unplugged his instrument and carried it toward the exit like he was carrying something precious that needed protecting. The club manager, a white man named Peterson who paid his bills by skimming profits, rushed toward the stage, shouting questions nobody answered. "What is happening? We have customers. You are under contract." But the musicians kept walking, silent as ghosts, disappearing through the back door into the December night that was colder than anything Peterson would ever understand about loss. Peterson stood alone on the empty stage, staring at abandoned instruments, hearing nothing but the confused murmur of 300 customers who suddenly realized the entertainment they paid for had walked out without asking permission. 4 blocks away at Small's Paradise, the same thing happened. The band finished their current song, then stood and left, like they had received orders from someone nobody could see. The singer, a woman named Clara who could make grown men cry with her voice alone, removed her microphone, set it gently on the floor, walked out without singing another note. The bartender stopped pouring drinks. The waiters stopped serving tables. Within 10 minutes, Small's Paradise was empty except for customers sitting confused in the sudden silence, wondering what they had done wrong, wondering if this was part of some show they did not understand. on Lenox Avenue. The Savoy Ballroom went dark. 500 people had been dancing when the lights shut off, and the music died like someone had cut its throat. They stood in the darkness, waiting for someone to explain what was happening, but no explanation came because none was needed. The doors opened. People filed out into the cold night, looking at each other, asking questions nobody could answer because the answer was not in words. This was not a strike. Nobody had called a meeting or voted on a plan or discussed strategy in smoke-filled rooms. There were no picket signs, no demands, no negotiations with management that would lead nowhere. The musicians and workers of Harlem simply stopped working, all at the same time, as if they had received a signal transmitted through air that white people could not hear because they were listening to the wrong frequency. Within 1 hour, every club in Harlem went silent. Every bar stopped serving. Every restaurant locked its doors. The neighborhood that provided entertainment for all of New York City shut down completely. And nobody could explain why, because the why was deeper than words or logic or anything that made sense to people who had never been disrespected systematically. At the 28th Precinct Station House, Captain Howard sat behind his desk, reading reports about nothing happening, which made him more nervous than reports about crimes in progress because nothing meant something was building. His phone rang, a club owner demanding police intervention. Another call, a theater manager complaining about loss of revenue, then 5 more calls, all saying the same thing with increasing panic. Harlem had stopped working, and nobody knew why. Howard sent 12 officers into the streets to investigate, to find something illegal they could arrest, something concrete they could control. They found nothing. No violence, no property damage, no violations of any law currently on the books in the city of New York. People were simply not working, which was not a crime in America, no matter how much it felt like one to the people losing money. The officers returned to the station with no arrests, no answers, just reports of a neighborhood that had gone silent for reasons they could not understand because they had never needed to. Downtown in the Velvet Room, Richard Carmichael was hosting a private party when his assistant interrupted with news that drained the color from his face faster than any disease. "Sir, we have a problem in Harlem." Carmichael set down his champagne glass, annoyed at the interruption to his celebration of crushing a small man. "So let them sit home. We will hire new musicians tomorrow who understand the value of steady work." But his assistant shook his head, contradicting his boss for the first time in 5 years of employment. "It is not just musicians, sir. It is everyone. Bartenders, waiters, cooks, cleaners, every black worker in every club across Harlem stopped working at the same time, like someone gave a signal we could not hear." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither man fully understood yet, but both felt like a noose tightening around something vital. The entire neighborhood shut down. Carmichael's face went pale. He understood numbers. He understood revenue. And he understood that every hour Harlem stayed silent cost him thousands of dollars in lost business. Money flowing out like blood from a wound that would not stop bleeding, no matter what pressure you applied. "Get me the mayor's office," he said, his voice tight as piano wire stretched to breaking point. "Get me the police commissioner. Someone needs to force these people back to work before this spreads." His assistant made the calls, but the responses were all the same, repeated like a chorus nobody wanted to sing. Nothing illegal was happening. Workers had the right to quit. Police could not force anyone to work without violating rights that even black people technically had in America. By 2 in the morning. The silence in Harlem was so complete you could hear individual footsteps from 3 blocks away, could hear dogs barking, could hear wind moving through empty streets like a ghost looking for something that used to be alive. No music, no laughter, no sound except wind and silence, and the occasional car driving past, looking for clubs that were no longer open, would never open again until respect was restored. White tourists who had come uptown for entertainment found nothing but locked doors and darkened windows, and the uncomfortable feeling that they were not welcome in a neighborhood they thought they owned. They returned downtown confused, angry, demanding refunds from taxi drivers who had no answers to give because the answers were not for them to understand. Stephanie St. Clair stood at her window, watching Harlem sleep in the darkness. She had not made a single phone call tonight, had not issued any orders, but she understood what was happening because she understood Harlem better than any outsider ever would. Harlem was a body, and Bumpy Johnson was its nervous system. When he felt pain, the entire body responded, protecting itself the only way it knew how, by withdrawing, by refusing to perform, by going silent. Bumpy sat in his apartment, listening to nothing. The absence of sound was louder than any music he had ever heard because it meant something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. This was real power, not the kind that comes from guns or threats or violence that leaves bodies in the street. The kind that comes from understanding that a city needs its workers more than workers need any individual job. Carmichael could hire new musicians tomorrow, but they would quit too. He could threaten and bribe and call in political favors accumulated over decades of corruption and backroom deals. But none of it would matter because Harlem had decided, without meeting or voting or planning, that respect was not negotiable, that dignity had a price, that some lines could not be crossed. The clock struck 3 in the morning. The silence continued, and somewhere in Manhattan, Richard Carmichael was beginning to understand that the man he humiliated tonight had not been defeated or broken or crushed under the weight of money and power. He had been patient. He had absorbed the insult, walked away without retaliation, and let Harlem respond in the only language that men like Carmichael truly understood. The language of money, the language of loss, the language of a city that stopped functioning until respect was restored to those who had been disrespected. The music would return eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, Harlem taught a lesson that would echo for decades about what happens when you take too much, when you disrespect the wrong man, when you forget that power does not always come from the people with the most money, or the biggest buildings, or the best connections. Sometimes power comes from the people who can make the music stop and the silence begin, and the entire city hold its breath, waiting for what comes next. Power in Harlem did not announce itself with speeches or newspaper headlines or politicians shaking hands on marble steps. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in nods exchanged on street corners, in debts remembered without being written down anywhere official. Bumpy Johnson never held an elected position, never owned a building with his name carved above the entrance, never gave interviews to reporters asking how he managed to control an entire neighborhood without a badge or a title. But everyone knew. The numbers runners who collected bets every morning. The landlords who needed disputes settled without courts getting involved. The mothers whose sons got arrested for crimes they did not commit and needed someone who could make phone calls that actually got answered. They all knew that Bumpy Johnson was the man you went to when the system, designed to help you, decided you were not worth helping. The system Harlem built to survive existed parallel to the legal one that mostly ignored black people unless there was money to be extracted or bodies to be locked up. While white politicians gave speeches about law and order, Harlem created its own version of both because waiting for justice from people who did not believe you deserved it was a guaranteed way to die waiting. The numbers racket was not gambling in the way white people understood gambling with its implications of vice and moral failure. It was insurance. A maid could bet a nickel on Tuesday morning before heading downtown to clean apartments for families who would never learn her last name. If her number hit on Friday, she collected $8. That $8 meant her children ate that week, meant the landlord got his rent and did not start eviction proceedings that would put her family on the street, meant she could buy medicine when someone got sick instead of watching them suffer, because a doctor's visit cost more than she earned in a month. Stephanie St. Clair ran the numbers with an iron fist and ledgers cleaner than most banks that refused to give black people accounts. She was 42, built an empire from nothing, settled disputes with violence that made people remember why crossing her was fatal. But she understood that violence was a tool, not a solution, something you used when all other options had been exhausted, and never before. Bumpy Johnson was her enforcer. But calling him muscle was like calling a surgeon a butcher, because both of them worked with knives. He kept order in a world that existed outside the law, which meant he had to be smarter than the cops who wanted to arrest him, and more ruthless than the competition who wanted to kill him. But his real power came from something deeper than fear or respect, or the gun he carried under his left arm. It came from being fair, from making decisions that people could predict even when they did not like the outcome, from protecting the weak when protecting them served no immediate benefit to him personally, from never taking more than his share even when he could have taken everything and nobody would have stopped him because they could not. 3 years earlier, a store owner on Lenox Avenue named Samuel had fallen behind on his protection payments, not because he was cheating or skimming or trying to avoid his obligations, but because his daughter needed surgery that cost more money than he would see in 5 years of selling groceries to people who could barely afford to eat. Samuel waited for Bumpy to come collect the debt with interest, calculated in broken bones and burned buildings. Instead, Bumpy showed up alone, walked into the store at closing time, sat down at the counter. "I heard about your daughter," he said, not as a threat but as a statement of fact. Samuel nodded, unable to speak because he was expecting violence and receiving something else entirely. "The surgery. How much do you need?" Samuel told him the number. Bumpy reached into his jacket, pulled out an envelope, set it on the counter. "This covers the surgery and 6 months of your payments to Stephanie." Samuel stared at the envelope like it might disappear if he looked away, like it might transform into something that would cost him more than money. "I do not understand," he said finally. Bumpy stood up, straightened his jacket, prepared to leave. "Your daughter is 8 years old. She did not choose to get sick. You did not choose to be born into a world where healing costs more than you can earn honestly. But you can choose to pay me back when you are able, and I can choose to wait." He walked out without another word, without a contract, without any guarantee that Samuel would honor the debt, but Samuel paid him back, not in 6 months but in 4, because Bumpy Johnson had given him something more valuable than money. He had given him dignity in a moment when the world was trying to take it away. And Samuel told that story to everyone who would listen, which meant everyone in Harlem heard it eventually. Stories like that were Bumpy's real currency. They accumulated over years, building a reputation that money could not buy and violence could not create. When he walked down 125th Street, people did not cross to the other side because they were afraid he would hurt them. They crossed because they respected him too much to waste his time with small talk when he was clearly thinking about something more important than weather or baseball scores. The legal system operated through violence that pretended to be order. Police arrested people. Judges sentenced them. Prisons held them until they either died or got released, with records that made employment impossible and survival even harder. It was loud, visible, performed for audiences who believed that justice meant punishment and rehabilitation meant making people suffer until they learned to hide their suffering better. Harlem's system operated through silence that actually kept people safe from immediate threats to their survival and dignity. Disputes got settled in rooms where no lawyers were present and no transcripts got recorded. Justice was swift, certain, and proportional in ways the legal system pretended to be but never actually achieved. Someone stole from a numbers runner. Bumpy found them, took back what was stolen, broke the hand they used to steal it. Not because he enjoyed violence, but because that person would never steal again. And everyone who heard about it would think twice before trying something similar. The difference was efficiency. The legal system took months to maybe punish someone while the victim suffered, and bills piled up and life continued getting harder. Bumpy's system took hours to definitely punish someone while everyone watched and learned and understood what lines existed. And more importantly, Bumpy's system did not pretend to be something it was not. It did not claim to be fair or just or designed to help people reform their lives through punishment. It was simply order maintained through clearly communicated consequences that everyone could understand, regardless of whether they could read legal documents written in language designed to confuse. When the music stopped across Harlem at midnight, it happened without Bumpy making a single phone call. He did not call the Cotton Club and tell William to walk off stage. Did not call Small's Paradise and tell Clara to stop singing. Did not call any of the hundreds of workers who simply stopped working at the same moment like they had received orders from someone. But they had received orders. Just not the kind that came through words or written instructions. They had received them through years of watching Bumpy operate, through understanding how he thought, through knowing that when he was disrespected, they were all disrespected because they were part of the same system that kept them alive. The invisible network that connected every black worker in Harlem had been built over decades through mutual aid and shared suffering and the understanding that surviving meant protecting each other. When one part of that network felt pain, the entire network responded without needing directions because the response was automatic. Cellular. The way a body pulls away from fire before the brain consciously registers heat. Bumpy Johnson was not the brain of Harlem. He was the nervous system. And when Carmichael slapped him with words in that private room downtown, every nerve in Harlem felt it simultaneously and responded accordingly. That was real power, not the ability to make people obey through threats, but the ability to be so integrated into a community's survival that harming you meant harming everyone, which meant everyone protected you without being asked because protecting you was protecting themselves. The legal system could arrest Bumpy tomorrow, could put him in prison, could execute him if they wanted to manufacture charges that would stick. But the network would remain because it existed independent of any single person, maintained by thousands of people who understood that their survival depended on maintaining it. Richard Carmichael would never understand that because he had never needed to. He operated in a world where power came from ownership and money, and the ability to call politicians who answered. A world where if something broke, you bought a replacement. If someone disobeyed, you fired them and hired someone more compliant. He thought Harlem worked the same way. Thought that taking over the numbers operation meant installing new management and expecting everyone to fall in line. But Harlem was not a business. It was a living system that adapted to threats by becoming something the threat could not comprehend or control. And tonight, sitting in his apartment, listening to silence, Bumpy Johnson understood that he had not orchestrated anything. He had simply been the spark that ignited something that was always there, always ready, always waiting for a reason to show the world what happened when you pushed too hard against people who had been pushed their entire lives and were tired of being pushed. The clock struck 4 in the morning. The silence continued, and across Harlem, people slept, knowing that tomorrow would bring consequences for someone, but not for them, because they had done exactly what needed to be done without being told. They had shown New York City that some things could not be taken by force or bought with money. That respect was earned through actions, not demanded through power. and that Bumpy Johnson had earned more respect by staying silent than Carmichael would ever earn by talking loud. By sunrise, the money had stopped flowing, which was when people who did not care about black musicians or bartenders or dignity suddenly started caring about something. The Cotton Club generated $15,000 in revenue on a typical Saturday night. Money that flowed from customer pockets to the register, to the owner, to the suppliers, to the politicians who looked the other way. That money stopped moving. $15,000 frozen in wallets that had nowhere to spend it because the entertainment was gone. Small's Paradise, the Savoy Ballroom, Connie's Inn, every club that made Harlem famous to white people who wanted to feel sophisticated by visiting. Every restaurant that served fried chicken and collard greens to tourists who thought eating black food made them cultured. Every basement speakeasy where jazz played until dawn. All of it closed. All of it silent. All of it costing someone money every hour that doors stayed locked. By Monday morning, the losses had climbed into 6 figures across the entire neighborhood, and the number kept rising because nobody knew when the music would come back, or if it would come back. Club owners started making phone calls to people they paid to make problems disappear. But this problem had no face, no leader, no demands written on paper that could be negotiated. How do you negotiate with silence? How do you threaten people who have already stopped working and have nothing left to lose? How do you arrest an entire neighborhood for the crime of refusing to be disrespected? The questions had no answers, which made important people nervous because important people built their lives on having answers even when the answers were wrong. Mayor Jimmy Walker's office received 50 phone calls before noon on Monday from business owners demanding action. The mayor, who spent more time with showgirls than constituents, suddenly found himself caring about Harlem because Harlem's silence was making his donors angry. Angry donors meant campaign contributions dried up. Dried up contributions meant his political career ended faster than a bad nightclub act. He called Police Commissioner Edward Mulrooney into his office, closed the door, spoke in a voice tight with frustration. "What is happening in Harlem? Why have the clubs been closed for 3 days? Why are my donors calling me asking questions I cannot answer?" Mulrooney sat across from the mayor's desk, looking uncomfortable in a way that made Walker more nervous because Mulrooney was not a man who showed discomfort easily. "We do not know, sir. We have questioned every club owner, every worker we can find. Nobody is talking. Nobody admits to organizing anything. The workers just stopped showing up to their jobs all at the same time." Walker slammed his hand on the desk, making papers jump and scatter to the floor in dramatic fashion. "Then arrest them, charge them with something I do not care what, just make this problem go away." Mulrooney shook his head slowly, choosing his words carefully like a man defusing a bomb. "We cannot arrest people for not working. Mr. Mayor, there is no law that compels employment. We cannot charge them with organizing a strike because there is no evidence of organization, no meetings, no leaders, no demands, just silence." "Then find evidence," Walker shouted, his face turning red in a way that suggested blood pressure problems. "Plant it if you have to, I do not care. The city is losing money. My donors are losing money. That means I am losing money and power and everything else that matters." But Mulrooney understood something Walker did not, something that came from 20 years of working in neighborhoods where the law was a suggestion rather than a rule. "Planting evidence will not help, sir. Even if we arrest 50 people, 500 more will stay home. Even if we arrest 500, 5,000 more will refuse to work. We cannot arrest an entire neighborhood. We do not have enough jails or enough officers or enough political capital to survive the backlash." He paused, letting that reality sink into Walker's skull through thick layers of privilege and assumption. "And more importantly, arresting innocent people will make this worse. Right now, It is just about money. If we start arresting people for not working, it becomes about freedom. It becomes a cause that spreads beyond Harlem into every black neighborhood in the city. It becomes national news that makes us look like tyrants oppressing citizens for exercising their rights. Walker stared at Mulrooney with the expression of a man who had just realized his power had limits he never considered before. So what do you suggest we do? Just wait. Just let them destroy the economy of an entire neighborhood. Mulrooney leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper like sharing a secret. I suggest we find out what they want and give it to them before this spreads further. What they want? Walker laughed, but it sounded forced, hollow, the laugh of someone pretending not to be scared. They are black workers in Harlem. They want jobs. They want money. That is what everyone wants. Mulrooney shook his head again. No, sir. They want respect. They want whoever insulted them to apologize. They want the people who control their neighborhood to understand that control is an illusion maintained through their cooperation. He stood up, preparing to leave before Walker said something that would force him to resign. And they want us to understand that we need them more than they need us, because without their music, without their labor, without their cooperation, Harlem is just buildings and streets, empty buildings, silent streets, no revenue, no tax income, no political influence, just a neighborhood that stopped functioning because someone forgot that power flows both ways. The door closed behind Mulrooney, leaving Walker alone with thoughts he did not want to have about systems he thought he controlled, but actually just participated in because the people at the bottom allowed it. Across the city, other conversations were happening in offices and private clubs and places where powerful people gathered to discuss problems that threatened their continued power. Richard Carmichael sat in the Velvet Room with 5 other club owners, all of them facing the same crisis and none of them understanding how it had happened so quickly. One of them, a man named Roberts who owned 2 theaters in Brooklyn, spoke first. We need to bring in workers from outside, from Philadelphia, from Boston, people who do not care about Harlem's politics and just want steady employment. Carmichael nodded, desperate for any solution that did not require him to admit he had made a mistake. I already made calls. I can have 50 musicians here by Thursday. We open the clubs. We show Harlem that they are replaceable, and everything goes back to normal. But another owner, a man named Fisher who was older and quieter, shook his head with the weariness of someone who had seen this movie before. It will not work, Fisher said, his voice carrying the weight of experience that made everyone listen, despite not wanting to. Even if you bring in outside workers, they will quit within a week, because Harlem will make them quit. Not through violence, not through threats, just through making them understand that they are betraying their own people by crossing a line that should not be crossed. He looked around the table at faces that wanted to argue but could not because they knew he was right. And even if they do not quit, customers will stop coming, because what makes Harlem special is not just the music. It is the authenticity, the feeling that you are experiencing something real, something that comes from this neighborhood specifically. White tourists do not come to Harlem to hear musicians from Philadelphia. They come to hear Harlem musicians playing Harlem music in Harlem clubs. So what do you suggest? Carmichael asked, his voice tight with anger at being told his plan would fail. Fisher looked directly at him, not blinking, not showing sympathy or judgment, just stating facts. I suggest you apologize to whoever you insulted. I suggest you do it privately, but clearly. And I suggest you accept that Harlem is not territory you can take. It is a partnership you can negotiate if they are willing to have you as a partner. Carmichael stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a knife across a plate. I am not apologizing to some numbers runner. I am not backing down because a few musicians decided to have a tantrum. I built my business on never showing weakness, and I am not starting now. He walked out, leaving the other owners sitting in silence that said everything they could not say out loud. That Carmichael had already lost. That his pride would cost him more than money. That the invisible power structure he thought he understood was actually beyond his comprehension, because he had never needed to understand it. That Harlem had just taught New York City a lesson about who actually controlled what. And the lesson was going to be expensive for everyone who refused to learn it. By Tuesday morning, 6 days after the music stopped, the panic had spread beyond club owners and mayors into the boardrooms of companies that depended on Harlem's economy flowing smoothly. Liquor distributors, food suppliers, taxi companies. Every business that touched Harlem was bleeding money because Harlem had stopped touching back. And the longer it continued, the more people understood that this was not about one neighborhood having a labor dispute. This was about power, about who had it, about who thought they had it but discovered they did not, about what happened when the people at the bottom of a system decided they were tired of holding up people at the top. The city was learning something it should have known all along, that you can own the buildings, control the money, write the laws, hire the police, but if the people who make everything actually function decide to stop, all your ownership and control and laws and police mean nothing, because you cannot force music, you cannot mandate joy, you cannot legislate cooperation, you can only earn it through respect, through fairness, through understanding that power is a relationship, not a possession. And Richard Carmichael, sitting in his office counting losses that grew larger every hour, was finally beginning to understand that he had made a mistake that money could not fix. The apology came on Wednesday morning, 7 days after Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Velvet Room, with his dignity intact and Carmichael's pride still inflated. It did not come through newspapers or public statements or speeches delivered from podiums. It came through a phone call from Frank Costello to Stephanie Street. Claire. Using words carefully chosen to convey meaning without saying anything that could be used against anyone if the conversation was being recorded. "There has been a misunderstanding," Costello said, his voice smooth as silk wrapped around a knife blade. "A certain businessman conducted himself inappropriately during a meeting with one of your associates. This businessman understands now that his behavior was unacceptable and wishes to communicate his regret through proper channels." Stephanie listened without interrupting, knowing that Costello was offering something without admitting anything, which was how powerful people apologized when they could not afford to look weak. This businessman would like to discuss a different arrangement. Costello continued, each word weighted with implications that both of them understood perfectly. One that respects existing operations in Harlem and recognizes the value of maintaining good relationships with people who have been doing business successfully for many years. He paused, waiting for a response that would tell him if this conversation was going to solve the problem or create new ones. "That sounds reasonable," Stephanie said, her voice neutral as Switzerland during a world war. "I will communicate this message to my associate and see if he finds these terms acceptable." She hung up without saying goodbye, because goodbye implied the conversation was finished, and nothing was finished until Bumpy decided it was finished. She called Bumpy an hour later, met him at a diner on 135th Street, where they sat in a back booth drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber but was hot and strong. "Costello called," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Carmichael is ready to back down. He wants to negotiate a truce that leaves our operation alone." Bumpy sipped his coffee, looking out the window at Harlem moving past on the sidewalk outside. People going to work, children walking to school, life continuing despite everything, because life always continued regardless of what powerful men were fighting about. "What does he want in return?" Bumpy asked, because nobody offered truces without wanting something back. "Nothing explicit," Stephanie said, lighting a cigarette, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. just an understanding that the music comes back, that Harlem opens again, that business returns to normal. Bumpy nodded slowly, thinking through implications and consequences and what came next after this moment passed into history. And if I say no, if I decide 7 days is not long enough to make the point. Stephanie leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than shouting. Then this becomes something else. Then the Italians get involved, not as mediators, but as problem solvers. Then people die. Then Harlem gets occupied by outsiders with guns who do not care about fairness or dignity, only about making money flow again by any means necessary. She tapped ash into a tray, met his eyes directly without blinking. You won. You made your point. You showed everyone that Harlem cannot be taken by force or bought with money. You humiliated Carmichael more effectively than any beating could have because you made him look weak in front of everyone who matters. Now you can take the victory and move forward, or you can push for total destruction and risk losing everything you built. Bumpy finished his coffee, set the cup down gently on the table. Tell Costello we accept. Tell him Carmichael stays out of Harlem permanently. Tell him the numbers operation remains ours without interference. Tell him if anyone tries this again, the music stops again. And next time it does not come back for any amount of apologies or negotiations. Stephanie smiled, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes but conveyed satisfaction at a job completed successfully. I will make the call. She stood up, dropped money on the table for coffee neither of them had really wanted. The clubs will open tonight. You should make an appearance at the Cotton Club. Let people see you. Let them understand that this ended because you chose to end it, not because anyone forced you. That night, Bumpy walked into the Cotton Club at 11, wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn to the Velvet Room 8 days earlier. The band was playing Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo, the music filling the space that had been empty and silent for a week. The crowd was smaller than usual. White tourists, still nervous about returning to a neighborhood that had shown it could shut down without warning. But the musicians were there. William on trumpet, playing like nothing had happened, like he had not walked off stage mid-song to participate in something larger than any individual performance. The bartenders were serving drinks. The waiters were carrying trays. Everything appeared normal except for the electricity in the air, the understanding that everyone in that room had just witnessed something that would be remembered long after they were all dead. Bumpy sat at his usual table with his back to the wall, ordered Barolo that cost $8 a bottle, drank it slowly while watching people who avoided making direct eye contact because they understood he was not someone to bother with small talk tonight. Stephanie joined him 20 minutes later, sitting down without being invited because their relationship had moved beyond needing invitations years ago. Costello confirmed, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the music. Carmichael has been told to stay out of Harlem permanently. The commission endorsed the arrangement. As far as they are concerned, you are the recognized authority here, and anyone who challenges that will be challenging them. Bumpy nodded. Not smiling, not celebrating, just acknowledging information that changed the landscape of power in ways that would take years to fully understand. What about Carmichael? He asked, because knowing where your enemies were was important even after they surrendered. What happens to him? Stephanie allowed herself a small smile, the kind that suggested justice had been served even if it was not the kind that came from courtrooms. He is finished in Manhattan, lost too much money during the shutdown, lost too much respect by backing down, lost too much credibility with his investors who are looking for someone more competent to manage their interests. She paused, watching the band play, watching people dance, watching Harlem come back to life. He will probably end up in some small operation in New Jersey or Philadelphia, assuming anyone will work with him after this. The story of what happened is already spreading. Every club owner, every operator, every person in the business knows that Richard Carmichael tried to take Harlem and got destroyed without a single punch being thrown. That was the real victory, not the apology or the negotiated peace or the money that started flowing again. The real victory was the story that would be told in every barbershop, every pool hall, every place where people gathered to discuss what happened when someone powerful tried to take something from someone they thought was weak. The story of how Bumpy Johnson got humiliated in front of witnesses and responded not with violence, but with silence. The story of how an entire neighborhood understood what that silence meant and responded accordingly. The story of how music became a weapon more effective than any gun. The story of how respect demanded was worthless, but respect earned was priceless. Bumpy finished his wine, stood up, straightened his jacket. "I am going home," he said to Stephanie. "Tell everyone who needs to know that business returns to normal tomorrow. Tell them we won because we stayed united. Tell them this only worked because everyone did their part without being told." He walked out of the Cotton Club into the December night that was colder than it had been a week ago. But he barely noticed the temperature change. Behind him, the music continued playing, would continue playing until dawn, would continue playing for decades because Harlem had proven it could survive anything as long as people understood their power came from standing together. Bumpy Johnson walked home that night, knowing he had not just won a battle against Richard Carmichael. He had won something larger. He had proven that power did not always flow from the people with the most money, or the biggest guns, or the best political connections. Sometimes power flowed from the people who understood that the system only worked if they cooperated, and if they stopped cooperating, the entire system stopped working regardless of what anyone at the top wanted. That was the lesson Harlem taught New York in winter 1932. That was the lesson that would be remembered long after everyone involved was dead and buried. That dignity was not something that could be taken. It could only be given away. And Bumpy Johnson had refused to give his away, even when refusing. Looked like weakness to people who did not understand the difference between submission and strategy. That night, Harlem won without fists or bullets or blood spilled in streets. They won with silence that forced an entire city to stop and listen. Bumpy Johnson never gave speeches or demanded credit. His power lived in what he refused to do, and in a community that understood him without needing explanation. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. If this moved you, hit subscribe, like and share to help us bring more untold stories of power and strategy. Tomorrow, a new case drops. Same time, different lesson. One question: if you were Bumpy, would you have hit back or stayed silent? Drop your answer below. I read every comment. See you tomorrow.